Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Al-Asl al-Khamis fil Bukhl wa Hubb al-Mal. Alhamdulillahi alladhi wakafa wa salatu wa salamu ala man la nabiyya ba'da wa amma ba'd. قال الله تعالى في القرآن المجيد والفرقان الحميد ومن يوك شح نفسه فأولئك هم المفلحون وقال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم إياكم والبخل فإنه أهلك من كان قبلكم. Respected listeners, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the sixth lecture on or bayan on the Arba'een, or the 40 principles of Imam Ghazali, which is a shortened version of Imam Ghazali's book Ihya Ulumuddin. And in the last number of lectures we've been going over the chapter or the section regarding those things that destroy a person spiritually. And last week we covered hasad, jealousy, which was a very short little section. Today we're going to cover another section of this chapter, which is bukhl. The fifth principle is bukhl, yani stinginess, being a miser. Stinginess and hubb al-mal, and the love of wealth. Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, when he talks about stinginess, he doesn't talk about haram wealth or being stingy with haram wealth or doubtful wealth, but he's actually talking about halal wealth, stinginess with wealth that's been acquired through halal means. And he says that al-bukhla, that stinginess or being bakhil, conjuice, min al-muhlakat al-azima, is from the great destroyers, annihilators that destroy a person spiritually. He cites a verse of the Quran Kareem in which Allah Almighty says, وَمَنْ يُوكَ شُحَّ نَفْسِهِ فَأُولَٰئِكُمْ الْمُفْلِحُونَ, that those people who have been saved from the stinginess of themselves, these people are successful. They are successful in the hereafter. In another verse of the Holy Quran, Allah Almighty says, وَلَا يَحْسَبَنَّ الَّذِينَ يَبْخَلُونَ بِمَا آتَاهُمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ وَخَيْرًا لَهُمْ. Definitely do not think those who are stingy with what Allah Almighty has given them from His grace, that is good for them. بَلْ هُوَ شَرٌّ لَهُمْ, but it is something bad for them. So يُطَوَّقُونَ مَا بَخِلُوا بِهِ, and they shall be made, soon they shall be made to wear iron collars of that stingy, of that item which they were stingy with regards to. They were made into iron collars, and they'll have to wear this on the Day of Judgment. Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in another hadith says, إِيَّاكُمُ الْبُخْلِ, that be warned regarding stinginess. فَإِنَّهُ أَهْلَكَ مَنْ كَانَ قَبْلَكُمْ, for indeed it destroyed those people that came before you. And Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says in another hadith, as-sakha, generosity, being generous, is a tree that grows in Jannah. فَلَا يَلِجُ الْجَنَّةِ إِلَّا سَخِيٌّ, and the only person who shall enter paradise will be the sakhi, will be the generous person. Al-bukhl, and stinginess, being a miser, shajaratun, is a tree, tumbitu fi nar, that grows in the Jahannam, it grows in fire. فَلَا يَلِجُ النَّارَ إِلَّا بَخِيل, and only the bakhil shall enter the fire. Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he also says in another hadith that three things shall destroy a person. Stinginess, that person obeys. Yani he's stingy but he obeys himself. وَحَوًا مُتَّبَعٌ, and khawaish, his desires that he follows. وَإِعْجَابُ الْمَرْءِ بِنَفْسِهِ, and a person liking himself. He's a person he's infatuated with himself. In another hadith, Nabi Karim sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, شَرُّ مَا فِي الرَّجُلِ شُحٌ حَالِئٌ, that the evil that's in a person is a restless stinginess. Yani his hands are itching, he has to be stingy. وَجُبُدٌ خَالِئٌ, and extreme cowardice. Yani a restless type of stinginess is the worst thing that can be in a person. In the books of seer, in the old books in Arabic, there's a story about a man. He was very stingy, and he was very stingy, and he received a guest, and he thought to himself, okay, Marigyo, why is this guy come at this moment in time? So he sends his son, and he makes a bit of a drama and natak, as they say, and he says, okay, go to the butcher shop and buy the best meat you can buy. Buy the best meat you can buy. So his son goes. He goes to the butcher's shop and he says, my dad sent me and he's told me that we have a guest. You have to buy the best meat possible. So then the butcher says, I'll give you a type of meat that melts in your mouth like butter. I'll give you a type of meat, when it's cooked, it melts in your mouth like butter. So the son, chip off the old block, he says, why do I need to go and buy meat? 12 pound a kilo, 13 pound a kilo. Why do I need to buy meat? I'll just go and buy butter. So he goes to the butcher's store. And he says to the butcher, he says to the person selling butter, he says, give me the best type of butter you've got. He says, I'll give you butter which is so good quality, it's just like honey. So he thinks to himself, why do I need to buy butter? I might as well go and buy honey. So he goes to the honey store and he says to the honey person, give me your best honey, Sidr, Manuka, whatever it is, the best type of honey possible. And he says, I'll give you honey which is so sweet, but it's so clear, it's just like water. It's just like water. So then he returns home and he tells his father that, his father says, have you brought the meat? He says, no. He says, why? And he explains the entire story. They went to the butcher, then he went to the butter seller, and then he went to the honey seller, and then he thought to himself, I've got water anyway, why do I need to buy honey? So his father says, he forgets the fact that he's got a guest there. And bakhil is bakhil, the kanjus is the kanjus. So the father says, mashallah, well done. He taps him on the back. But he says, but you missed out on one little point. He says, what? He says, going from one shop to another, you've worn your shoes out a little bit. You've worn your shoes out a little bit. So the son says, Father, don't worry about that. I wore the guest shoes. Yani, shuhun haliun, restless stinginess. Stinginess that just overcomes a person completely. Nabi Karim sallallahu alaihi wasallam in another hadith says, Inna Allah yabghadu al-bakhil fi hayati wa yuhibbu as-sakhiya inda mawti. That indeed Allah Almighty, He hates the stingy person in his life, and He hates, He loves the generous person at the time of his death. Nabi Karim sallallahu alaihi wasallam also said in a hadith, as-sakhiyul jahul, the ignorant sakhi person, is more beloved to Allah Almighty min al-abid al-bakhil, from the worshipper who is bakhil. Nabi Karim sallallahu alaihi wasallam also says in another hadith, la yajtami'u fi mu'minin al-bukhl wa su'ul khulq, that stinginess and bad manners cannot gather inside a believer. So these are some of the hadiths that Imam Ghazali rahmatullah mentions about stinginess in itself. Now, what he then goes on in this next section is he describes and he says that the root of stinginess is love of wealth. That the love of wealth makes a person stingy. That this is also reprehensible. And if you want to read about all of this stuff, the best thing to read in your leisure time is Fazail al-Sadaqat, Hazrat Sheikh. First part, second part. I think the 5th chapter is all about stinginess, or the 4th chapter section is all about stinginess. Hazrat Sheikh Rahmatullah has described all of this with a lot of depth, and he's given full justice to all of these topics. Love of wealth and stinginess also has a chapter inside there. But coming back to Imam Ghazali Rahmatullah, he mentions in this section, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing, he mentions some important points. He says, can a person who has no wealth also be in love with wealth? Can a person, sometimes we think that person who's got wealth, he's the only person that loves wealth. We don't have much in our pocket, we just got enough to live our daily lives. Do we also love wealth to that extent? Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi says that this person who does not have wealth, he's not able to be bakhil because he doesn't have anything, but he also can be a victim of this illness of loving wealth altogether. Why? Because he's running after it as well, although he doesn't have much. Sometimes a person, as a Shaykh Rahmatullah writes in Fazail al-Sadaqat, the person has lots of wealth, but because he's completely detached from the wealth, he just considers it to be a means to an end. He's not a person of dunya in itself, although he might be a millionaire at the time, and he gives generously with the right niyat. Whereas a person who has nothing, but he runs and hankers behind it, then he becomes a person of dunya. Imam Ghazali Rahmatullah alayhi says, can a person who is generous also be a lover of wealth and dunya? And he says that yes, he might be generous, but then he wants to be known as a generous person, and this in itself is reprehensible. And he says, then there is a principle that he outlines here. He says that love of wealth makes a person ghafil, it makes a person unmindful, heedless, ignorant of the dhikr of Allah Almighty. It turns the heart towards the dunya. It controls his indulgence to an extent that death becomes difficult for him. and death is where a person meets. And this is the principle that he outlines, that when a person is engrossed in dunya to this level, then this is something that's reprehensible and a person needs to tackle himself. It's an illness, he needs to tackle it. He then mentions a verse of the Quran, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu la tulhikum amwalukum wa la auladukum an dhikrillah. O believers, let not your wealth and your children turn you away and make you ghafil from the dhikr of Allah Almighty. He also says, Innama amwalukum wa auladukum fitna, that your wealth and your children are fitna. And then there's a very famous surah of the Quran Karim, Al-Hakumut Takathur, that plentiful, having lots, has made you ghafil and made you mindless of Allah Almighty. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says in another hadith, Ayyu ummatika asharru. He said, which person from the ummah is the worst? Nabi Karim sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, Al-Aghniya, the rich. Why? Because they're completely engrossed in it. They're running out. They don't have no time for Allah. And then he says in another hadith, Man akhadha min ad-dunya fawqa ma yakfihi. Whoever takes from the dunya more than his need, akhadha hatfahu wa huwa la yadri. He has taken his own destruction and he doesn't know. A person came to Nabi Karim sallallahu alayhi wasallam and said, Inni la uhibbul maut. He says, I don't love death. Nabi Karim sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, do you have wealth? He says, yes. Nabi Karim sallallahu alayhi wasallam, Qaddim malak, send your wealth ahead in the hereafter. Yani deposit in some good cause. فَإِنَّ قَلْبَ الرَّجُلِ مَعَ مَالِهِ. For indeed a person's heart is attached to his wealth. فَإِنْ قَدَّمَهُ. When he sends it ahead, أَحَبَّ أَنْ يَلْحَقَهُ. He loves to meet it. And if he leaves it behind, then he wants to stay behind. And then he says in a very famous hadith, إِذَا مَاتَ الْعَبْدُ. When a person or a slave dies, قَالَتِ الْمَلَائِكَةِ. The angels say, مَا قَدَّمَ. What has he sent ahead? You know, when a person dies, we say, how much did he leave behind in his bank? But the angels say, مَا قَدَّمَ. What did he send ahead? وَقَالَ النَّاسُ. And the people say, مَا خَلَّفَ. What did he leave behind? وَقَالَ Nabi Karim sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, Ta'isa abdul dinar. Let the slave of the dinar be perished. And let the slave of the dirham be perished. Wa abdul khamisa. And the person who's hankering behind embroidered garments, meaning he wants to wear fine clothing. Ta'isa wan takasa. Nabi Karim sallallahu says that let him be perished and let him be perished even more. Wa idha shika. And if he was to be, and then he gives him a dua. If a thorn was to hit him, if he was to be pricked by a thorn, then let there be no one who removes it from him. So this is some of the hadiths of the reason why bukhal is a bad thing, because it turns a person away from the dunya. But people will say, okay, Moulana, you need some wealth. You need a bit of wealth. You need something in your pocket to help you along. And Imam Ghazali then describes this. In this section, he says that the reality of wealth, he says that what is the reality of wealth? It has a good nature to it, and it also has an evil nature to this. He says, and he explains something very important. What he says is that all wealth isn't bad. And from every perspective isn't a negative thing. And he supports this with a hadith. He says, Ni'mal malu salihu lirrajuli salih. How great is the good wealth for the pious person. He also says, Ad-dunya mazra'atul akhirah, that the dunya is the kheti, is the farm, is the land to be farmed for the hereafter. Yani you farm it, you harvest something for the hereafter. It's the harvest for the hereafter. And then he says, and he explains this in a unique way. He says, and he draws a comparison between a person and a traveler. He says, how can it all be bad? How can wealth in itself, in its all entirety, be bad? When the slave is traveling to Allah Most High, the dunya itself is a station. It's a stopping point. It's a place where you stop for a little while in order to refuel. His body is his ride. His body is his ride. He is unable to travel without his body. The body cannot be preserved without food and clothes. And these cannot be acquired except through wealth. And then he says that the person who understands the benefit of wealth, and he knows that it's a tool to acquire fodder for the animal, for the body in its journey, then he doesn't stop on the wealth, but he just uses it. And he carries on. He takes what's sufficient and he focuses on moving on. And whatever is sufficient, he's happy with that. And then he explains this in a hadith. He says, has Sayyidina Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, he advised her once, إِذَا أَرَدْتِ اللِّحَاقَ بِي, when you intend to meet me, فَقْنَعِي مِنَ الدُّنْيَا بِزَادِ الرَّاكِبِ, then be suffice from the dunya with the provision of a rakib, of a traveler. وَلَا تُجَدِّدِي, don't buy new garments. وَلَا تَخْلَئِ قَمِيصًا حَتَّى تُرَكِّعِيهِ, and do not take off your clothes or don't discard your clothes until they have some holes in it. Nabi Karim sallallahu alaihi wasallam also made a dua, Allahumma jal quta ali Muhammadin kifafan, that oh Allah, make the provisions of the progeny of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam kafafan, yani just enough for them. And then he says that a person is like the traveler. إِذَا أَخَذَ مَا يَزِيرُ عَلَى زَادِ الطَّرِيقِ, if a person takes more than he needs, مَاتَ تَحْتَ ثَقِلِهِ, then the weight and the burden whilst his journey becomes difficult for him. وَلَمْ يَبْلُغْ مَقْصَدَ السَّفْرِ, he won't reach his destination. So taking more than what he needs, there's actually a harm in this, and the harm is in from three ways. Number one, and as Shaykh Rahmatullah alayhi, he mentions these, he mentions a few more from Ihya Ulumuddin, but in Arba'in, Imam Ghazali has shortened it. He says that having too much wealth, more than one's means, more than one needs, actually leads to three destructions. He says too much wealth beckons to sin. Yani his ability to sin increases. It becomes harder to abstain. You know, the opportunity to do sins with wealth increases greatly. And being patient at that time becomes even more difficult. Having too much actually turns one towards sin. The second thing he says, having too much wealth beckons to a life of comfort in those things that are permissible. And when this becomes the situation, when you have lots coming in, you become habituated to a comfortable life. And then you can't live a Spartan or a coarse life. And he's got to maintain that lifestyle. And when he has to maintain that lifestyle, he then turns to people. He turns to the transgressors. He might lie a little bit. He might fiddle the books a little bit. He might play around a little bit in order to make sure he can maintain that life and have that income coming. So this is the second negative of having too much. He then says the third thing is that the wealth makes one heedless. It makes one ghaflat or ghafil from the zikr of Allah. And that's the foundation of the hereafter. If someone's happy with the zikr of Allah Almighty, then he's happy in the hereafter. And this is something that he forgets. After this, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, he then goes into a bit of a description and he mentions how much is sufficient. And to be honest with you, he goes to a very difficult position, which many people would not be able to tolerate in this day and age. You know, I spent the weekend looking at the writings of Hazrat Thanvi rahmatullah alayhi, because Hazrat Thanvi rahmatullah alayhi, he was a muhakkik Sufi. He was one of those mashayikh who influenced our mashayikh greatly. And in his writings, he's written on lots of these topics. And I wanted to see, does Imam Ghazali, Hazrat Thanvi rahmatullah alayhi, does he talk about how much a person should have financially in a year? And he doesn't go into it at all, which is a bit of a comfort for us, because we need a bit of cash coming in, I think. But then he makes, Hazrat Thanvi rahmatullah alayhi, he comes out with a few principles. So I'm not going to describe what Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi says. If you want to know, you can meet me later. I'll tell you exactly. He tells us to suffice on very little. But Hazrat Thanvi rahmatullah alayhi, he says that you should remain with the dunya. Yeah, he says that remain with the dunya, but we're not being told to be. You stay in the dunya, but you remain aloof from the dunya. You don't let it enter yourself. He says that we are not allowed to completely engross ourselves in dunya. That the shariat and the deen and the zikr and the remembrance, everything becomes secondary. He adds that gather wealth. But he also says remain ascetic, yani be a zahid. Have tawakkul on Allah. And this you achieve by not attaching one's heart to wealth and not trying too hard to earn more than one's need. And tawakkul is that you don't focus on the wealth, but you focus on Allah Almighty. And whatever wealth comes, fulfill His hukuk completely. Give in charity, with the right intention. Give the zakat, give the sadaqah. Don't hanker after it. Some people, they work, they miss Jummah. They miss Jummah. They miss the namazes. They miss their prayer. Ramzan time comes, they work in a factory, it's too hot. They can't fast. Find another job. No, but they'll carry on with that job. They'll make their deen secondary to their own personal needs. And that's not something that one should do. So the Tanvir Rahmatullah alayh, he mentions this. There's another principle that Imam Ghazali Rahmatullah alayh mentions. He says, your intention should be to acquire the dunya to assist you in deen. And by acquiring dunya, your intention should be to remove difficulties that you might have. When you have a bit of money in your pocket, you've got food coming in, you've got a house, you're able to warm your house, you got some clothes, you're able to live comfortably, then at the same time, you're not worried. And because you're not worried, you can come for namaz and pray namaz and you can indulge yourself in pure ibadat completely. So the intention should be to be engrossed in ibadat, but not to indulge in pleasure. And whatever is left over, one should then give in sadaqah, giving charity. Imam Ghazali Rahmatullah alayhi thereafter, he then goes and explains a few other things. One of the things he mentions, very interesting thing, he says that wealth is like medicine. He says that wealth is like medicine and a person should believe this very strongly. They have firm belief that it's like medicine. And when you take medicine, what is beneficial is a measured dose. A measured dose. Overdosing could be lethal. You could lose your life. Pharmacist sat in front of me there. Overdosing could be lethal. But if not lethal, then it could make you extremely sick. It could make you extremely sick. He then says, take less. Avoid overdosing. Don't take too much. And the luxuries that come out of wealth, that's a great danger as well. Having less wealth, then he says, having less wealth with a bit of difficulty is a bit difficult for a few days. But then he says something very interesting. وَلَيْسَ فِي التَّقْلِيلِ إِلَّا مُشَقَّةٌ قَلِيلَةٌ مِنْ أَيَّامٍ قَلَائِلٍ. He says having a little wealth is a bit of difficulty for a few days. وَذُو الْحَزْمِ. And a person who has will, لَا يَثْقُلُ عَلَيْهِ. It's not difficult over him. And يُجَوِّعَ نَفْسَهُ, that he makes himself hungry. لِوَلِيمَةِ الْفِرْدَوْسِ. In order to have the walima in Jannat. That's what he then says. لِعِلْمِهِ بِأَنَّ اللَّذَّةَ عَلَى قَدْرِ الْجُودِ. Whilst knowing that the ladhat and the pleasure that he's going to receive in the hereafter is going to be even greater. After that, Imam Ghazali Rahmatullah alayhi, he describes stinginess, and I'll wrap up in a few seconds. He says we need to know what the description of a stingy person is. And he says, and this is what Hazrat Tanvir Rahmatullah alayhi, all our Kabir, mashallah, it's quite interesting for me reading or looking at Imam Ghazali, because then you compare it with what our Akabir has written. And Akabir, they probably contextualize it for a modern audience. And you see the reflection of that, where they've benefited from Imam Ghazali, but then they've contextualized it for our time. Imam Ghazali says that he describes what is bukhal, what is a stingy person. So number one, there's two things. As the time he mentions the same thing. He says the one who doesn't spend where the Sharia demands him to spend. He's bakhil. And the second is, he doesn't spend where self-honor, muruwat, yani a person's self-honor demands that he spends. Yani, a person needs to spend on Shariat, for example, Hajj is wajib upon him, he doesn't go, that's bakhil. Zakat is wajib upon him, he doesn't spend, that's bukhal. Yeah? But then also spending at home, spending on your family, spending on friends, spending on extended family in the right way, without israf, with the right intention, a person doesn't spend, and this is also bukhal in itself. And bukhal is something, it's something that sometimes, some people do need to be taught a lesson in this. One of the stories, it comes, Moulana Ibrahim Pandor Sahab, Daman Barakatum, he mentioned this story in one of his bayans. He says that, and it comes in some of the old books, that there was a man who was extremely wealthy. He came home, he sat down to eat, his wife prepared some food, they laid down the dastakhan, somebody knocked on the door. So she went to look, and he was a beggar asking for something. She came back, she said, oh, there's plenty of food, let me go and give some to this person. And the husband said no, and he became angry, and he told her off. And she felt bad in her heart, and this beggar, he went away. Many years later, something happened between them, and they separated. She married another man. He was, mashallah, very wealthy as well. And again, same scenario took place. She sat down to eat, and somebody knocked on the door, and she went there, and she came back and said, there's a beggar there. And he said, oh, take, there's plenty, go and give. And she took and she gave him the food. She came back, she was very upset. And this is mentioned inside some of the old Arabic kitabs. And then she turns around and she says, and she's upset, so the husband asks, and he says, why are you upset? And then she explained the entire story. That the person who was knocking on the door, the beggar, was once upon a time my wealthy husband, my previous husband. And this is what happened. And I remember that day. The husband turns around and he says that, and the beggar that came that day, that was me. That beggar that came that day, it was me. So sometimes things like this actually happen. When I was living in Saudi Arabia, we had a friend of ours in the office at the Arab News, and he used to tell us stories. And there's a story that happened in Riyadh, which was inside the newspapers a little while before I joined, and I went there. But he told me about it, and it was quite common. A lot of people knew about this story, that there was a person in Riyadh who was extremely stingy. In fact, he was so stingy, his name became Abu Rus, the father of heads. And you might wonder, why is he called Abu Rus? Because every time he wouldn't buy, if he went to buy lamb or meat, he wouldn't buy a shoulder or a leg or any of the mixed meat. He'd buy heads. Yeah, you could buy heads over there. And he'd have they'd cook the brain, the tongue. The tongue's actually quite tasty. And then there's pieces of meat on the head. He used to buy that. And he used to survive on this. But he was extremely wealthy. Extremely wealthy. A lot of real estate in Riyadh, apparently. This guy's name was Abu Rus. One day, it so happened that one of his tenants didn't pay up. Wasn't paying, and he's avoiding him, completely avoiding him. So he traveled across the city. He went to find this person, couldn't find him. Someone said, oh, he prays namaz in such a masjid. So he went there one day, and he couldn't see him. He went the second day, he couldn't see him. He went there the third day, he couldn't find this person. And this another person who saw him, noticed him, he said to him, you look like you're not from this area. Where are you from? He said, I'm from such an area. I'm looking for such a person. He said, everything okay? He says, yeah, he's one of my tenants. He's not been paying up, etc., etc. So Abu Rus told him about him. So he said, oh, come to my house. I've got a dawat. I've got a party. You're invited to come. So he says, okay, mashallah, I'll get some free food. He's a very conjuice, stingy person. So he goes with him to his house, gets there, big mansion. Yeah, big mansion. Beautiful house. Cars parked up outside, fountain, goes inside. He's got a butler. In Jeddah, they used to have butlers and stuff, maids, etc. He's got a butler. He goes inside. He's, mashallah, very impressed. Lots of people there. He sits down to eat. He sits in the majlis. There's a drinks reception. He has the drinks, orange juice, whatnot. And then thereafter, they sit down to eat. Beautiful food. He eats to his full. And then he's about to go, and he says to the person, the guy comes to meet him, and he says to him, oh, you're going? He said, etc. Yeah. He said, tell me, Abu Rus says to him, tell me, what do you do for a living? He goes, oh, I'm just a humble person. He goes, no, what do you do for a living? Tell me really. Are you a prince? Are you from a royal family? So the guy says, no, I'm not from a royal family. He says, no. He said, you must be a businessman. He says, no, I'm not a businessman. He said, you must have a ministerial role within the government, Riyadh capital. He says, no, nothing. So tell me, what's the secret of your wealth? He said, I've got a bit of a strategy, a very short strategy. Sorry, I'm going over time, yeah? I've got a small strategy, but it's a secret, you don't tell anyone. So he says, okay. So he says, I scan the city. And if I see and I find out who the rich people are. And when they pass away, I marry their wives. When they pass away, I marry their wives. And like this, I've got 3 wives. So Abu Rus is like, really? He said, yeah. He said, mashallah, this guy was a pious person. He looked pious, dresses well, handsome. He says, like this, I've got 3 wives. And the wives are very generous with their money because it's not their money, it's the late husband's money. He goes, I've got space for one more. And I hear in such an area, there's a very stingy man. They call him Abu Rus. Yeah. وَبَلَغَتِ الْقُلُوبُ الْحَنَاجِرِ. His kaleja, it says in the ayat, his kaleja apne gale tak pahunch gaye. His insides came up to his throat. Abu Rus, he went completely white in the face. They say it's a true story. And he said, he said that there's another guy who's, he's old. He's very stingy, I've heard, and inshallah, I'm just waiting for him to pop his socks. I'm going to marry his wife. And his name is Abu Rus. He lives in such an area. So Abu Rus, he said, and they were talking, he said, what's your name? He wouldn't tell him his name, and he left quickly. He ran. He ran quickly. And then he went home, he took his wife shopping, and he completely changed his life. From stinginess, he became extremely generous. I don't know if it's a true story or not, but it's a funny story. But anyway, the point is that sometimes stingy people, they also need to learn a bit of a lesson. The last section, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi will wrap up here. He says that the cure for stinginess comprises of two things. And he says first is ilm, yani having knowledge and perspective. And the second is a certain action. And the knowledge that a person should have that stinginess leads to destruction in the hereafter and criticism in the dunya. The second thing is, know that wealth doesn't follow one to one's grave. It is from Allah and He gives it us to fulfill our needs. That's the second thing. And the third thing is that hoarding all that cash, all that money, what's it actually for? If it's not for the hereafter, you're going to leave it behind for your children. If your children are pious, then alhamdulillah, you've invested greatly, and giving him that wealth might lead them astray. And if they're astray, then you're actually supporting them in committing extra sins. So these are the three things a person should think about mentally. And there's a fourth thing that a person should do in terms of action. He should force himself to spend until it becomes a complete habit. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.